Welcome. This is episode 7 of Your Life is the Medicine. Thank you so much for being here and for listening. I am excited to be here and I'm excited to be doing this at all. It feels like a gift. I want to talk about grief today, which is not a topic that we talk about often. It is a topic that I think is so important because grief lives in our bodies, and most of us haven't had models of really working with grief or of moving with grief or of even how to relate to grief. And it feels like, to me, a really important skill or an important understanding to be well and to really be able to experience joy in the world. I'm going to start by saying, well, first of all, I want to talk about what grief is or isn't. And in our society, we often talk about death grief, right? When we do talk about grief, it's around sort of big events like death and loss or loss of a relationship or something that's really big. And those are important types of grief. And there's grief in every day. There's grief in what changes about our body as we age. There's grief in getting a medical diagnosis. There's grief in becoming a new version of ourselves, right? We may love the version or we may love what's happening and also grieve what we had before or who we were before. There's grief in changing of relationships. There's grief in realizing that the new version of ourself needs different relationships or needs to move through the world differently. So there's so many things that we grieve. When people get sick with a serious illness, there is so many types of grief that come up. Again, there's the grief of the diagnosis. There's grief in sort of a changed relationship with your body. There's a grief in the loss of what the future looked like, so that the anticipatory grief. There is grief as people lose their roles in their family or they lose their what they feel is their purpose in a job or in the world. And so there are so many ways that we grieve, and yet most of those things that we grieve, we don't talk about. And I think that's what's important, is that we recognize how many different types of grief there are, and then we learn how to develop a relationship with that grief. I will also say that there is individual grief and there's collective grief. So individual grief is really my own grief, the grief that is unique to me. And yet also there's collective grief about things that happen in the world, about environmental destruction, about what's happening politically in our country and what's happening to people in our country because of the politics. And so there's ways that we also feel grief that is shared, and then we have our own individual grief. And people often want to compare, well, my grief isn't as big or as important as someone else's grief because I might be grieving a lost relationship while they lost a person, or I'm grieving a lost pet and they lost a person, so my grief isn't as important. And that isn't true either. There's no benefit from comparing grief. My experience and my grief is real, as is yours. And I want to talk about grief today because to me, fall is a season that evokes grief. And personally, I've been sitting with my own grief. So fall as a season evokes grief for many of us as we see the plants and the leaves and sort of the earth die or go inward. And for me also, the loss of light often evokes grief. When I walk out of the hospital in the evening, on the days I work in the hospital, and it's dark and I feel like I didn't see the day, I have a grief response that I feel like I lost a day. And so to me, this is really a season of sacred grief. In Chinese medicine, one of the meridians in the fall is the lung meridian, and the emotion associated with the lung in Chinese medicine is grief. And so there is this connection seasonally to grief. And then I will also say that for people who have lost relationships or lost loved ones, as we move into the season of holidays, grief is often triggered or more potent, more felt, and can be really heavy. And so there's so many ways that grief shows up and grief lives in our body. And unexpressed emotion really can make us physically unwell. And we're understanding the link scientifically between unexpressed emotions and chronic inflammation and chronic disease, and things like autoimmune disease and IBS and chronic migraines and chronic pain and some of those things. Like the emotional body and the physical body are not separate. They are absolutely connected, and our physical body is often expressing or manifesting what is needed, perhaps on our emotional bodies or on a spiritual energetic level. And so there are so many reasons to learn to express and relate to and have a relationship with grief. And I will also say that grief is heavy, and when we learn to move grief and release grief, it helps us feel lighter and we have more access to joy. And so that has been my journey with grief. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay, and my experience of funerals in the United States at home, which I was a Peace Corps volunteer after finishing college. So when I left when I was 22-ish, and I had been to a number of funerals in the States at that point. Two of my classmates in high school died, and those were big events for me, was going to their funerals. And my experience of funerals was of grief contained, of people holding themselves together, and of restricting and restraining emotion. And then when I went to Paraguay and I went to my first kind of overnight, trying to think of the word, overnight wake or vigil, and then the funeral, there was openly expressed raw emotion with tears and crying and wailing and raw grief. And it was so shocking to me. It felt wrong to me because it wasn't what I had seen. And I just remember not knowing how to even witness that expression of emotion because it was too raw, because it wasn't restricted and it wasn't contained. And that was my first real experience of raw grief. And as a physician and as a palliative care physician, in my palliative care training, we of course talked about grief. We talked about complicated grief and anticipatory grief, and we learned about risk factors for complicated grief, and we learned how to talk to people about anticipatory grief. But we weren't really taught about how to help people with grief. And we certainly weren't taught about our own grief and how the grief I see in other people absolutely triggers my own grief. And that we need to tend to our own grief to be well. And so as I started working with patients and sitting with patients, and patients began to teach me about their grief, they taught me all of the ways that grief shows up, just like I just talked to you. They shared their grief around not being the provider in their family or not being able to take care of other people the way that they did before, the grief over bodily functions and independence that they lost, their grief over their lost future, their grief over their lost identity, their grief over the possibility of dying, the grief of leaving people behind. So many types of grief. And yet, in that setting, I learned how to witness people's grief. I learned how to talk to them about grief and how to show up for grief. And I still didn't really learn how to help people process and move grief. And it's only in my own exploration outside of conventional palliative care that I began to learn more about grief and learn how to do grief work. And I would say I'm still in the beginning of my learning. And yet I think it's important to talk about because many people aren't willing to talk about it. And yet to me, when we talk about it and when we show up for grief, we find some freedom and we find some joy and we find some levity. And that's where our humanity is. It's in the full experience. And so that's why I talk about grief, teach about grief, sit with my own grief, is because I think that we all need to learn more and more how to be with grief and how to identify grief. And I'll say that it can be sneaky in the sense that even with all of my own sort of exploration of grief. Maybe a month or so ago, I ended a working relationship with a coach that I had been working with for a while. And it didn't end in the way that I anticipated. And it ended abruptly. And it felt like there was anger. And I was just sitting with it all day and saying, like, I feel yucky. This just feels yucky. And finally, after several hours, I was like, oh, this is grief. I am grieving the end of this relationship, and I am grieving what I hoped that I could accomplish with this person that just didn't work out. Like, that wasn't the journey. But it took me several hours to realize that it was grief. And once I could name it, then I can attune to it, and then I can work with it, and then I can ask what it's telling me. Because at first I realized I was grieving the end of the relationship. And then I realized I was also grieving what I had hoped I could accomplish, right? And those are two different things, and they're both important. And so that's what I mean when I say that grief can be sneaky, and sometimes we don't even realize it's grief that we're feeling. And with practice and with asking kind of over and over, then we can get quicker at identifying more accurately when grief is running the show or when grief is showing up. One of my favorite books about grief that I have found thus far is Francis Weller's book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. And he starts his book by saying, this is a book about grief, about its many moods and movements, shapes and textures. It is about how sorrow carves riverbeds in our soul, deepening us as it flows in and out of our lives. There's something familiar about the rising and falling of loss, how it takes us below the surface of our lives and works on us in some alchemical way. We are remade in times of grief, broken apart and reassembled. It is hard, painful, and unbidden work. No one goes in search of loss. Rather, it finds us and reminds us of the temporary gift we have been given, these few sweet breaths we call life. And he says, I'm not sure how or when I began my apprenticeship with sorrow. I do know that it was my gateway back into the breathing and animate world. It was through the dark waters of grief that I came to touch my unlived life, by at last unleashing tears I had never shed for the losses in my world. Grief led me back into a world that was vivid and radiant. There's some strange intimacy between grief and aliveness, some sacred exchange between what seems unbearable and what is most exquisitely alive. Through this, I have come to have a lasting faith in grief. And that's what I teach. I teach that the way to work with grief is by building a relationship with grief. This idea of an apprenticeship with sorrow, that we need to come into relationship with our own grief, that we want to ask our grief what it needs and why it's there, what teaching or message it has for us. Often when people talk about grief, they talk about sort of moving through it or getting to the other side of it. And my experience is that grief comes in waves, and you sort of move through a layer of grief, and then at some point it shows back up. And then you move through it again and it shows back up. And it shows back up at different times and unexpected triggers and places. And so the goal is not to get rid of the grief, but the goal is to honor the grief, to know the grief, and to be in relationship with the grief, to walk with the grief on a journey of love and understanding and compassion, because that grief is there because it's teaching us something. It's giving us a message about what it is that we loved and lost, or where we were untrue to ourselves in some way. We often grieve where we abandoned ourselves, where we didn't stand up for ourselves, where we let ourselves be mistreated. And so there is always a message or learning in the grief. And I do want to have the caveat that it is easier to work with and reflect on some types of grief than others, or it is easier later on in a grief journey to take learning from it. And earlier in a grief journey, we may just need to grieve. We don't have to examine it. We don't have to ask what it's there for. Early in our grief journey, we may just need to grieve. We may just need to feel it. And in time, that journey will shift and change, and there will be opportunities to learn and to move the grief. But early on, we may just need to grieve. Practices that are helpful for grief, in my experience and from what I have learned from many wonderful teachers. And I will say that my learnings from grief come in part from doing grief work as part of an integrative medicine conference, a grief ceremony. And, the idea that in many traditional cultures, there are rituals for grieving, for ritual grieving in community. And we don't have that typically in our culture, in our country, in our society. And so I have participated in ritual ceremony for grief as part of at an integrative medicine conference with the Andrew Weil Center for Integrative Medicine. And for me, that was that first experience of being in a grieving ceremony was uncomfortable, of course. And for me, actually, I connected a lot to animal grief, to the grief of my horse who has a lot of trauma, to the grief of nature. And then I've done, along the way, I met Dr. Amanda Hansen and attended her event in Phoenix called Magnetic. The next one is happening the first weekend of December. If you're at all curious, it's incredible. But she teaches a practice called swamping, that she calls swamping, that she adapted from Mama Gina. And Mama Gina's Regina Thomas Schauer. She wrote the book Pussy, a Reclamation. And in the swamping practice with Dr. Amanda Hansen, it is expressing grief through dancing or somatic movement with music. And so there are 3 songs with grief, anger, and sensuality, or grief, rage, and sensuality. And when I was in Phoenix and first did this practice, it was the first time I realized how interconnected grief and rage are. For me, many of the things I was grieving, for example, how I have been treated as a physician in medicine at times, were intimately connected with rage about how I've been treated as a female physician. And so I share that so that when you are working with grief, if rage appears, know that they are often interconnected. They are often feeding each other in some way. And so that is a practice I learned and continue to do, is swamping. And when I lead grief circles, we do a version of swamping. I use music for grief. So we do 3 songs with movement to express grief. And this may be dancing. This may be laying on the floor, pounding on the floor. It may be rocking. And sometimes it's hard to stay with the emotion for 3 songs, but it is really about connecting over and over to the grief and allowing it to be and allowing it to move through your body. And then I always finish the practice with a song that, again, the way Amanda Hansen taught me, it's about sensuality. And for me, I really talk about it as like the image of the phoenix rising from the ashes. It's about you moving your grief and then being with the sensation of rising up, of being strong, of moving with the grief and being stronger for your journey through the grief, if that makes sense. But it is ending this practice on a note of strength and of rising and of really connecting to your own deep strength and knowing that you are able to be with the grief. On a side note, many people are afraid of grief. They are afraid of feeling the grief because they feel it is too big and it will swallow them whole. And it is remembering that we have the capacity to be with our own grief. And sometimes we do need helpers, but we absolutely have the capacity to be with our grief and to honor it and to move it and to be with it. So swamping is another practice to be with grief. The other practice I really love is journaling and reflecting. And some of the reflection questions that I use when journaling and working with people with grief are, number 1, where do I feel grief in my body and what does it feel like? What sensations are there? Is it heavy? Is it tight? Is it squeezing? Is it stabbing? Is it painful? Like, what are the actual sensations? How big is it? How small is it? What shape is it? And really, again, feeling where that grief is living in your body. Number 2, what is my grief telling me? And you can actually write to yourself from your grief and just free write. What is my grief telling me? My grief wants me to know ... 3, how do I push away my grief? How am I like wishing the grief weren't there? Or how am I stuffing the grief down or pushing it away or not letting it in? 4, how do I let my grief in? Like, when do I allow my grief? When do I accept the grief? And 5, how do I honor my grief? So journaling is another practice. Another movement practice for grief that's very helpful is shaking. So rhythmic shaking. And I like to find music that I can shake to. And I start with my hands and then add in more and more of my body. But really spending at least 3 to 4 minutes shaking and feeling the grief as you shake. So connecting the emotion to the movement, because again, we want to help move the emotion and move the energy in our bodies. And lastly, the other practice really is ritual. And rituals that I love for grief, again, involve, number 1, you can make an altar. So I said that grief has been present for me recently. I had to put down a horse last week. And yes, the grief is still very close to the surface to talk about it, but I had to say goodbye to one of my horses. And with my kids, we made an altar in our home with a picture and a candle and some dried flowers and some of his mane. So creating an altar or some sacred space where you are honoring and remembering what it is you grieved. Another ritual that I love to do is with flowers and taking flower petals or flowers or leaves or plants and releasing them in water. So having the intention, holding the plants or the flowers, putting your grief or your love into the flowers and asking that it be moved or honoring it in some way as you release it into the ocean or into running water. Another one is also sometimes I've created an altar on the earth. So collecting leaves or rocks or, things that to me speak of beauty and arranging them in a space on the earth where I know that they will be protected, and really releasing the emotion and the grief into the objects on the earth, and always thanking the water or the earth or the objects for helping to move your grief. So those are the practices that I use. Those are practices I teach and love, because we don't want to hold the grief. We don't want to stuff the grief in our bodies where it can be heavy and can make us unwell. We want to allow the grief to move and to be, and to teach us and to show us what we loved, and to show us where we want to do better or where we want to honor ourselves, and let it serve without making us ill or without making us heavy. So I hope that this was helpful. It's not the lightest topic, but the goal is to be lighter by moving our emotions. And I do want to honor that sometimes we need professional help. Sometimes we need some sort of healer to help support us in our grief. And that is about following your own intuition and wisdom and saying, is this grief that I can work with, or is this grief that I need more support in order to move with and to help me be well? And there is absolutely no shame in getting help. The goal is to be resilient and get back to well as soon as possible. And if help is what makes that happen, then that's wonderful. So to close, I want to read another quote from Francis Weller. We were not meant to live shallow lives, pocked by meaningless routines and the secondary satisfactions of happy hour. We are the inheritors of an amazing lineage, rippling with memories of life lived intimately with bison and gazelle, raven and the night sky. We are designed to encounter this life with amazement and wonder, not resignation and endurance. This is at the very heart of our grief and sorrow. The dream of full-throated living, woven into our very being, has often been forgotten and neglected, replaced by societal fiction of productivity and material gain. No wonder we seek distractions. Every sorrow we carry extends from the absence of what we require to stay engaged in this one wild and precious life. And every sorrow is made more difficult to metabolize by that absence. Grief work offers us a trail leading back to the vitality that is our birthright. When we fully honor our many losses, our lives become more fully able to embody the wild joy that aches to leap from our hearts into the shimmering world. When we fully honor our many losses, our lives become more fully able to embody the wild joy that aches to leap from our hearts into the shimmering world. My hope is that as each of us learns to walk with our grief, as each of us begins our own apprenticeship with sorrow, learns to listen to the messages of our bodies, learns to be with and walk with grief rather than stuffing it in our bodies, that we find greater wellness and well-being, and that we connect to that beautiful joy in that vitality that is our birthright. Please, please reach out with questions, comments. I would love to hear what you think and what your own experience has been learning to be with grief in a different way. My thoughts are with anyone who is grieving, and I send so much love your way. Thank you.